Guys, Jerry inspired, very special guest, Vivian, aka Vivian Walker here. And she's a international relations expert. She teaches at Georgetown, and one of her focus areas is public diplomacy, which is something that I've been interested in since freshman year at University of Pennsylvania. So anyways, welcome, Professor Dr. Vivian Walker, aka just Vivian.
It's a pleasure to be chatting with you, Jerry. I look forward to the conversation.
Definitely. Thank you. So did you know when you were going to college or even high school that you end up in international relations? You've been doing what you do now?
No, actually, I thought when I was in high school that I was going to be a writer, maybe possibly a poet. I loved reading, I loved literature, and as perhaps a sign of my ultimate nerddom, I was a stalwart member of the Creative Writing Club. Mm-hmm. And, every month or so we gathered in one of the dusty classrooms and exchanged our deepest thoughts. You can imagine what some of that stuff looked like. Anyway, I had that dream, but I ended up going as an undergraduate to Georgetown University, and not just to Georgetown, but to the School of Foreign Service. Why, you might ask? Did I end up at the School of Foreign Service? That's a really good question. I'm not sure. Someone had mentioned it, that there was such a thing. Back in those days, in my youth, we did not have intensive college recruitment or advising programs. It was kind of catch as catch can. So someone mentioned that as a possibility. It sounded intriguing. I was always aware of the outside world, the bigger world outside suburban California where I grew up. My mother is Hungarian, survived the war, World War II in Hungary, escaped from Hungary in 1956 during the revolution when the Soviet tanks overran Budapest, and then eventually emigrated to the United States. So through my mother, I had this sense of a whole nother world, other histories. And I think that was probably tickling at the back of my mind when I threw caution to the winds and signed up for the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown.
Wow.
So the journey began there, but it almost ended there because I'll have to say, I looked around at my colleagues in the School of Foreign Service undergraduate. They were so much more accomplished than I was. They knew all of the answers to the economics and history and government and all those things that we had to take, very good courses. And they always had their hands up in the air, ready to say something, where I was, really more of the school of taking my time to think through things. So I looked around at all of them and I said, there's no way I'm going to be a diplomat. This is not for me. I want to think deep thoughts. So I went off and got my doctorate in literature, ended up at the University of Chicago, or a PhD in reading books, as one of my sons said many years ago. It's exactly what it was. So so I was at School of Foreign Service, had got a great education, but also decided in all of my wisdom at 22 that this wasn't my future, which shows you how much you know about your future at 22, right? So then I went through, I did my master's at UCLA and then doctorate at University of Chicago. And I was lucky enough to have some generous fellowships, but I also worked as the managing editor of the Journal of Modern Philology out of University of Chicago Press. And then something happened. I looked around, kind of like the way I looked around at Georgetown. And I thought, do I want to spend the rest of my life trying to get tenure, writing articles about Shakespeare or the poetics of Gerard Manley Hopkins, wonderful poet, by the way, that nobody would read? And the answer was, no, I wanted to see the world. So then I took the Foreign Service exam and joined. So I've had this, I did a lot of zigging and zagging, and only retrospectively, when I look back on my career, because here I am back in academia, right, back in teaching, when you look at it in the rear view mirror, it makes a lot of sense. At the time, I think my friends and family thought, what is up with her?
Wow. So two things I can say that really relate to your experience. One thing, even in high school and onwards, I was always I wanted to listen, I wanted to process. And I always felt it was unfair when teachers would call them the quiet people because it's not that they're not paying attention. They just want to process. And then after I graduated college, I found out about introversion versus extroversion, all that stuff. And I realized, okay, our education system has not done enough research into how to reach certain types of students.
Mhm.
And I will say one of my biggest memories is the few times I did speak out in class in undergrad, I said really good stuff. I didn't speak out much, but the few times I did speak out, so that's more support for people like Vivian or I. Like, don't think we're not listening. Don't think we're not paying attention. It's just there's a lot of cogs in our head that are going, and in fact, it's probably going very deep.
I think that's true. I am a classic introvert, by the way. I don't know if you know the Myers-Briggs profile. Yeah, so I don't know if they still use that profile, but certainly when I joined the Foreign Service as part of the initial training, we were all given the profile test, and I came out as INTJ, which also interestingly happens to be the classic Foreign Service profile, to my shock. But yes, I am an introvert. But when I mention that to people who know me from my teaching, perhaps, or have worked at me, they find it hard to believe that I'm an introvert. As I suspect, Jerry, with you, people probably find it hard to believe that you're an introvert. But I think when we are into something and engaged and interested and want to exchange ideas, there's no stopping us. It's just that we also have this place of reflection and of preparation that is more obvious, let's say, in a classroom where where you're there to learn and to sort of build on your skills. I think that's where the introversion is more prominent, and much less so when we are in our element, as we are now, I would say. And we don't seem like introverts. So I think I don't know if it's not a state of being, it's a process. I think of it that way.
Yeah. And the second thing to really relate to your experiences, I've also zigzagged a lot. So when I reached out to Vivian, I was applying to the MSFS and applying to a bunch of other schools. And why was I applying? Because I took a break from formal education for a long time, worked in tech, worked in media, worked as an entrepreneur, did a lot of things. And it's knowing all that, looking back, it helped me, I think, in all my applications, because this guy has seen the world in a different way, can process it in a different way, can talk to anyone, right? So I was like, it all makes sense looking in retrospect, even though it's like, why didn't you just go directly to something like this? Everyone thought this dude was going to be a statesman, a diplomat. It's like, but why did you take so many zigzags? Because sometimes until you're ready, you're ready. Kind of like Vivian, you Chicago's amazing school and you wrote for a philology magazine. That is crazy. Like, it takes something like that. That's amazing.
You're too kind, but yeah, you just I think there is an element of trust in yourself, but there's also making the effort to see things in a different way. And so I mentor a lot of students at Georgetown when I'm teaching now in the MSFS program, and they all come to me and they say, well, what are the courses that I need to take at Georgetown, and what are the internships that I need to make me a successful fill in the blank foreign service officer, think tank, NGO, in any number of positions in the foreign affairs world. And what I tell them is something that not all of them want to hear, which is, you don't need another course in international relations theory. You don't need another course in negotiations. Take an art history course. Do a market researching unit in the B school, in the business school. Do something that is out of what your concentration is and out of your comfort zone, because that forces you to it sort of breaks the kind of models that you have developed for yourself to get through these courses, and forces you to build them up again, to look at things in a different way. Because when you're a diplomat, knowing something about economics and negotiating skills are important. It's also true that everything you need to be able to be successful in the economics portion or the negotiations portion is already, in a sense, built into the job. But the most important quality, I think, for being a diplomat, and I'm talking about, writ large, is that ability to think on your feet, to be flexible, to pivot, to be able to see things the other way around. And taking course after course in the same mold doesn't necessarily produce that effect. So
That makes a lot of sense.
That's the lecture I give. And, you know, one or two of them maybe listen. The rest of them say, thank you, Professor Walker.
So let's segue into your time in the Foreign Service. How was it? Tell me all about it.
Well, I had the time of my life in the Foreign Service. It totaled up for about, when you pull it all together, about 30 years. So a good chunk of my time. And I was lucky enough to be funneled toward public diplomacy, which turned out to be the right specialization for me within the broader range of diplomatic specializations. And at the time, that meant being funneled toward the U.S. Information Agency, which until 1999 was our standalone agency, like USAID was a standalone agency for foreign assistance. There was a standalone agency called the U.S. Information Agency who was focused on press, on culture, on communication, all those things that we call public diplomacy. And so when I joined, which is a few years before USIA was closed down and consolidated into the Department of State, that was, I joined as a junior officer focusing alternating between press and cultural work. And that came very naturally to me because of my academic background. You know, I think I told somebody else recently that, you know, in a sense, I never really left graduate school because the thing about public diplomacy was that it allowed me to be both teacher and student. And the world was my classroom. Because what do we do in public diplomacy? We provide access to information, we explain our policies and our positions, we prepare speeches and talking points, we communicate in multiple different ways to reach audiences in a way that supports our own interests and objectives. But at the same time, the job of a public diplomacy officer is to listen, to be receptive, to understand the environment in which they are working, culturally, historically, socially, because that understanding of the audiences that you're trying to reach will make you a better communicator with those audiences and ultimately serve your own interests. So there's a very realpolitik intention behind this listening and openness, but you have to start with listening and openness. And that's something that, again, as someone who loved reading and writing and teaching, and I do love teaching, that was very natural to me. And the other part of it that I really enjoyed was, in addition to the information projection and provision and all that, that's a very important part of public diplomacy. There was the opportunity of give people scholarships, fellowships, internships, visiting programs to learn about not just the US, but about their own professions, their own specializations in a different context. So giving people access to information and ideas that they could take and then bring home to their own countries to make change in their own time and in their own way. Now, the trouble with these programs, especially according to the funders, the people who, the OMB, the congressional budget, is what do you get for the investment in those scholarships, in those long-term in exchange programs? And the answer is nothing in the short term. Everything, or maybe not much in the long term, but the potential that you have exposed someone to a way of doing things that's different, that will do good in some way in their own country. And if their own country is stable, is stronger as a result of whatever that experience was, that ultimately does play into US interests, because what do we want above all else? We want stability. We want we want order, we want peace. So these exchange programs, these training and education opportunities are truly an investment in the future, but one that is kind of a leap of faith. And a leap of faith that is often quite difficult to explain to people who in the short term are looking for impacts and results. But that part of it appealed to me enormously. So it meant that it gave me great joy to be a part of that.
And I would love to provide you an analogy just from the private sector, because in the private sector, and I'm thinking about my time at ByteDance, I had arguments all the time with some of the more technical people on my team, or technically different teams, but we're working on the same projects. They're like, why do we care about marketing? Why do we care about social media? Why do we care about press? Why do we care about PR? You know, why do we care about impressions? They're like, we only need conversions, right? They're thinking about day-to-day short-term results. In the Chinese company, it was called an OKR, similar to a KPI, but even more strict. And we'd always be like, it's not about the immediate thing. It's like, what if they see it in a year? And it's like, oh, now I'm ready to download the app, right? Talk an ad. But like applying that to what you're saying, it's like, okay, maybe they come over here for an exchange program for a year. And then when they apply to college, they want to come here for college. And then they're working at a company later when they're, you know, older, and they have a positive view, right? They want more investment. That's what you think about. That's public diplomacy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, it's a longer game. And the challenge has been, and it's certainly never been more serious in the current administration. The challenge is what I've called it in a couple of articles, is this failure of strategic patience. Soft power, which is essentially what we're talking about, you know, is changing people's or affecting people's attitudes and outlooks through persuasion rather than coercion, is a long game. And it requires time and investment. And the problem with that is, in the short term, leadership, what do they want? They want results, and they want to be able to take credit for the investment. So, and this is within this realm of soft power, and public diplomacy is sort of the primary sort of toolkit that the US government has in terms of producing soft power effects. Public diplomacy does not produce short-term impacts, and you cannot say that as a result of our investment in this particular scholarship program, here are the three things that happen. You can't do that. And when you've got a leadership that is interested in short-term transactional relationships, this kind of work doesn't seem to matter. But it's such a mistake. It's such an oversight, because if the U.S. retreats from soft power, from the projection of these basic values of transparency and open and free information exchange, there's a vacuum that gets filled. And it gets filled by other actors who can then step into that space. People talk about the retreat from soft power now as a loss for the US, but a win, let's say, for China or Russia. I disagree. I think when you retreat from soft power, there are no winners, only losers. We all lose. So I think this is, so as much as I enjoy doing the work of public diplomacy, one of the hardest and most challenging aspects of it, which continues to this day in my current capacity as co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America, is this making a case for an approach to engagement in the global media space that is not supported by short-term transactional results-based engagement.
Yeah, there is so much to unpack about this. And I have a conversation sometimes with a neighbor who, he loves thinking about hard power and soft power.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, I think they're both needed, but I don't think you can ever say, don't invest in soft power. It's like they almost like, it's like like a hamburger. It's like the buns to a meat, right? They make a hamburger together. I think that's the way to make it.
You are right. They all work together, but I drop the hamburger, and I'm going to give you an arrow. Okay? Pretend there's an arrow, right? So let's say you've got, the instruments of power, and I'm using you've heard of the dime model, that every country has a set of tools at its disposal to further its interests in the foreign policy realm, in the international realm, and those are diplomatic, military, economic, and information tools, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. And we also know that no single initiative is just purely diplomatic or purely economic. There's always elements of built into one another. But let's say that for now, we are looking at this arrow here, my imaginary arrow, and we're talking more or less about the use of information. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got what you would call classic soft power, or the use of persuasion, right? In the middle, and down the middle, you have what strategies of inducement or more transactional uses of information. Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, called it smart power. That is providing information and access to ideas in exchange for something. Maybe it's in exchange for information. Maybe it's in exchange for more positive attitude or behaviors that are more supportive. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the coercive use of information. There we think of disinformation or information manipulation. And that is using information to dismay, to disrupt, to destabilize. So every country moves up and down that spectrum. There are times when we absolutely use information coercively, right? It's part of our defense, whether it's particularly, in military operations, to use information in a way that protects our interests or elicits a particular response from target audiences. In wartime, that's an acceptable use of information. Transactional exchanges of information, getting something for you. That happens all the time. And then, of course, there are the more purely persuasive, where most of public diplomacy lies. So in saying that in advocating for soft power, I'm not advocating exclusively for soft power, but advocating for recognition that along that spectrum of tools that we have, that soft power is as legitimate and as important as more transactional or in strategies of inducement, or on the far end of the spectrum, using information coercively. And so I think that's important to make clear too. Hard power there are times when hard power is the tool that you need, but when you resort exclusively to the use of hard power tactics, you do so at great expense to your reputation and to your credibility in the global information space, which has consequences down the road.
Yeah. Wow. So during your time, those 30 or so years, did you do a lot of traveling, or is it mostly based in the US?
No, I spent most of my career outside the United States. In fact, I didn't have my first Washington job until I was about 15 years in. So I went to, I started in Morocco, and then I went to Haiti and was there. My very first real job in the Foreign Service as press attaché, right before the coup d'etat of 1991. So that was a real trial by fire. And then I went from Haiti to North Africa, back to North Africa to Tunis. And then I went from Tunisia to Kazakhstan.
Wow.
And then I went from Kazakhstan to Armenia. And it was only after Armenia that I finally went back to Washington to work. And I ended up running, being the director of for the Office of Press and Public Diplomacy for Europe, for the European Bureau. Wow. So I was in all of the countries I named. And then, of course, when I was working in Central Asia, I traveled to, all over the region. And when I was in the Caucasus as well, I've had exposure to the other countries as well. So yeah, most of my time abroad. And then after Washington, I went back out, and where was I? I was in Croatia and the Balkans, and then I went to Afghanistan, and then finally came back to Washington for the last couple of, last few years of my career.
And let's just say your time in Kazakhstan. What was the day in the life like?
Let me explain the context, and then you'll understand why day in the life was a little difficult. So I arrived in Kazakhstan in 1998. So the former Soviet Union had broken up, right? Kazakhstan was a newly independent state, but just a few years into the process of figuring out how to function as an independent state, right? And what the diplomatic corps and the multilateral organizations were very focused on, and not just the U.S., but all of them, primarily Western, was working with Kazakhstan to build basic civil society institutions. So, for everything from managing your education, to the electoral process, to small and medium business enterprise, to taxation, to all of those pieces, parts that go into a democracy, things that we perhaps take for granted because it's simply part of but all of these, the ways of thinking, and the most fundamental relationship of all is your relationship with the state. During the Soviet era, there was a very particular relationship with the communist state, and it was well defined, and there was no question. But it also put all of you had no freedom, but all the responsibility also lay with the state, in terms of providing jobs and healthcare and education, right? It was all on the state. You had no freedom, but the state gave you everything, such as it was. In a democratic context, there's a social contract that has to work both ways. The state has to take care of, support the citizen, but the citizen has to also support and invest in the state through things like paying your taxes and anyway. So it was a huge learning curve, and we are trying to bring these democracies, these new democracies along, and we're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed with our ideas and our values, and we then find ourselves in countries where the infrastructure, such as it was, had collapsed in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether it was the education infrastructure, whether it was the economic structure, medical, health, everything had to be rebuilt. So it was a time where, on the one hand, you had enormous possibility. I, for one, in addition to the scholarship programs that I ran, sending Kazakh citizens, many of whom who never left Kazakhstan, because under the Soviet Union it was very difficult to do, suddenly we're sending them, to the outside world and introducing them to ideas and concepts and practices that were very new to them. And that was extraordinary, but it was also very hard to categorize or manage. And when they came back to Kazakhstan, with all that they had seen and done and experienced, back to a country that was still trying to rebuild itself from the inside out, that was really challenging. And it made, it put this whole business of exchange and scholarship and all these other opportunities, put it in a whole new light. That it wasn't simply a matter of getting people out and to the programs, but what happens when they come back. So that was one thing that was very interesting. Another really interesting thing was what I ended up calling this sort of a donor dependency that we created. So we would have these, we had the Democracy Commission, which was a marvelous idea. We had a commission that was made up of folks around the embassy. We had certain areas where we wanted to focus on environment, human rights, anti-corruption, education, and we had small grants to give to local organizations to launch an initiative or do a project in support of these ideas. Sounds great, right? Well, what local organizations? The whole idea of having NGOs and activist organizations in the former Soviet Union, non-existent. And then, and then 6 or 7 years later, we're coming in with our bags of money saying, okay, so people, of course, the people, the local experts soon figured it out. They put together NGOs. They lined up for the grants that we were able to give them. But remember this too, those folks running the NGOs, they were probably former lawyers, doctors, professors, engineers, who in this new space didn't all have jobs. This was an opportunity. This was one of the few new and fresh sources of income. So there was fierce competition for these grants. And it wasn't competition based, so, it was a kind of a survival of the fittest. And what happened was I worried that as we were handing out these grant monies, that what we were creating was a sort of a source of income, but not necessarily a way into starting to build the institutions in the way that they needed to be built. So my typical day, coming back to that, would be everything from looking at grant proposals, identifying candidates for the next Fulbright program, traveling around the country to bring lectures and speakers on ideas such as the political process or entrepreneurship or environmental protection, or bringing art from the West that had never been there before. I, for example, brought an exhibit of Andy Warhol's art to Kazakhstan. So back in the day, this was the last days of the U.S. Information Agency, we had what was the Arts America division, where we had traveling exhibits, and not just exhibits, the art, but we also had theater, ballet, music. And we would send these theater troupes or these exhibits around the world to provide audiences with an experience of American art and culture. Doesn't seem like much in the digital age, but in the pre-digital age, this kind of access was nothing short of, extraordinary in some places. And certainly in a place like Kazakhstan, where Andy Warhol being kind of would not have been something that they would. So that was the kind of thing. So you would, I remember bringing this exhibit and working on that. And so it was that kind of environment.
Wow. Absolutely fascinating. And, you mentioned that Haiti was a trial by fire. Was there any posting you had where it was just like, oh my goodness, I feel like I'm so on top of things? Or was it all like every time it's like, oh my goodness, oh my God, I'm so bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. Okay, I need like 3 months to adjust and then like 6 more months to really figure it out.
Always, every assignment. Anyway, I think if you arrive in a country and think you have it all figured out, you shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
Because now this goes back to my teaching and learning analogy. I think they're part of the learning curve is being open to being taught, learning about the environment and the context you're in, to the point where then you have enough confidence in your ability to make assessments about the best course of action in support of your own interests. Because the more you learn, the better able you are to advise the policymakers back in Washington. No, the attitude toward that kind of an approach in this country is going to be very negative based on this experience. So if we are going to pursue this policy, this is how we think it should be introduced on the ground. So if you arrive in a country thinking, I've got this, then you're a waste of time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, do you want to talk a little bit about Haiti, or does it bring back like too much stress?
I think it's an instructive tale.
Mhm.
It was only my second assignment in the Foreign Service, and my first assignment as a full-fledged, Foreign Service officer. In the U.S. Information Agency, you spent your first year or two as what we called a junior officer trainee, where you actually spent time in each section of the embassy, the consular, the political, the economic. You learned the ropes of all of the different parts of the embassy, and before you went and did an assistant cultural affairs or an assistant press position. So I'd done that in Morocco, and then why Haiti? Well, I'd gotten married, and my husband was a military officer, and it was one of the few places where we could both work. He is an attaché, a military attaché. But also there was an opening there because the information officer, because it was a more senior position than I was in theory ready for, he had been declared persona non grata because over one too many Cuba Libres rum punches at the Hotel Olofsson, he'd had to sit down with a well-known American newspaper and told them what he really thought of Haiti and our policy, and was not an off the record. And so he was asked to leave and had an opening, and junior officer me gets the job. So I'm already, I'm being put into a more senior level job, but they needed to fill it. So, and then I get there a few months before the coup of '91, which overthrew the democratically elected president Jean-Bertrand Aristide. And I arrived in Haiti just a few months before, and so when the coup d'etat happened, I was the press attaché on the ground. And so it was like going from 0 to 100, and being a press attaché in a crisis environment, in an environment where the phone lines were down, the radios weren't working very well. It was difficult to communicate with one another, let alone Washington. One of my earliest experiences in that regard was going with my boss, who was the public affairs officer, and I was the press officer, to the airport because the OAS, the Organization of American States, of which the United States was a member, was attempting to negotiate with the leaders of the coup d'etat. It was General Raoul Cedras at the time. So the negotiations were taking place on neutral territory in the airport. That way the OAS could fly in, meet, and then leave without having to enter the city, which was pretty lawless at that time. And our job was to manage the press availability following the discussion, where the principals would come out as they do. Well, we were there with the press corps, such as it was, and at that, when the type of press corps that comes to a place where there's a coup d'etat, they're tough, and they've seen a lot of these, and they're in it for the story and whatever it takes, right? Danger be damned. All right. I tell you this because at some point word had gotten out that the OAS was negotiating with Cedras, and the petit soldat, the common soldier, who was not part of the coup d'etat was managed by the military elite. They heard about these negotiations, and they were concerned that their rights and their interests would not be adequately represented by the military leader of the coup d'etat. And they supported Aristide. So they surrounded the airport. And they're armed, such as, and then they stormed the building where the negotiations were taking place in back rooms. And I was there with the press. So as they come up the stairs with their arms, what does the press corps want to do? Get out there and take pictures and film it. And what did I want to do? And my boss? Get them out, because not only were they in danger, but the T soldats were concerned that if their faces or images were captured on film or in photos, that could endanger them, so that the soldiers wanted no part of it. And so that was one of my first press availabilities, was that thing. So there were some interesting moments like that. But then I think something that I think about to this day was my own relationship to our policy at the time. Now, let me backtrack and say that over the last few years, shall we say, I've been approached by a number of young people who say, I would have wanted to go into the Foreign Service, but I will not now because I cannot possibly represent that leader. And the question then becomes, who are you representing, and what are you representing when you're in the Foreign Service? What I tell those young people is, yes, you have to uphold the policy of your country, but now is the time more than ever when we need people like you to represent to the rest of the world who we really are. That leadership may reflect one facet of us as a nation, but we are so much more. So the positive side of it is that in the Foreign Service, you are upholding your policies, but in your behaviors, in your actions, and what you are communicating, you are also telling a very powerful and credible story about your country. That's the good news. But the bad news can be sometimes your policy really is truly wrong and is having an effect, an unfortunate effect. And I saw this with the US government policy, along with the OAS, following the coup d'etat, with the imposition of the embargo on Haiti and sanctions. And they were primarily on fuel and food sanctions to punish. It was an attempt to punish the government, the elite. In reality, the elite had access to everything they needed. In Pétionville, in the mountain suburb where we were living, there were grocery stores, and you could find 10 kinds of cornflakes. But the rest of the country was starving. So that embargo had the absolute opposite effect of what it was intended to do. And what did people do? I don't know if you remember. They got on leaky boats and makeshift rafts, and they attempted to reach Puerto Rico or even Florida, and tried to present themselves as political rather than economic refugees. We didn't want them, those who survived. But guess what? Most of them did not survive. We don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands, of them died in the waters between Haiti and whatever that promised land was. Bill Clinton was running for office in that period for his first term. One of his campaign promises was, if I'm elected president, I will welcome all Haitians to the United States. Do you know what happened as the returns came in on the night of his election, and it was clear that he was winning? More people took off on those boats than in any other time. So there was an instance where our policies were responsible for much of the disaster and suffering there. And we might have said the right things, but we were never going to actually come through. And so that was really hard to see. So we would get congressmen, women, congresspersons. You could come in, fly in from Miami in the morning, go visit a slum hospital or an orphanage in Cité Soleil, which was the huge slum just outside not far from the airport, between the airport and the capital of Port-au-Prince, where I had spent a day or two searching for the best photo opportunities. Get your picture taken next to the nuns or the Sisters of Charity, with 1 or 2 or 3 sick babies. Hand over, I don't know, 10 bags of corn flour or whatever, and you could be back on the plane that afternoon, sipping a Cuba Libre at Joe's Stone Crab in Miami that evening. And my job was to scout those photo ops. And that upset me tremendously. And I thought about, how can I continue to do this when this is so clearly wrong, hypocritical even. But I had been in the Foreign Service not that long, but long enough to understand that were I to raise my hand and say, that's it, finished, they would say, thank you very much, Ms. Walker. Here's your ticket home. And, and 10 days later, guess what? Someone else would be doing the job. So in other words, my gesture, such as it was, would not have an impact at all on the policy. So I decided to stay and keep doing it because I thought, all right now I can't change the policy. I can continue to provide more context, a face to our policy and who we are as a people in this context. And more importantly, down the road, if I stay in, maybe I will stay in long enough to be able to, I want to say, pay it back karmically, but find ways. I could not do any good in that moment, clearly. But if I stayed in, I would have opportunities to do the right thing. And I think that turned out to be the case. But it came down to a personal decision. And I tell people that the best Foreign Service officers, I used to say, you have a letter of resignation drafted in your desk drawer. Now you have a letter of resignation in your draft folder. But you have, if you're not asking yourself continuously, not obsessively, but continuously checking in with yourself, is this the right thing for me? Am I, if you cannot apply critical thinking to what you're doing and what your government is doing and where you stand and how you feel about it, then I don't think you're that effective of an officer. Because that means that you've considered all of the options and you still make the choice to go and fight that fight every day. Then by all means do so.
That's a very powerful story. And I know we could probably talk for like 5 hours, but I'll end with this question. When and why did you decide to start teaching?
Well, I always liked teaching, even before I knew that I was a teacher. I was the one who, would sit my little friends down and, and try to hold school with them, apparently. I loved storytelling. I loved explaining things to people. So, and then I thought going into getting a doctorate in literature, I thought, I would love being in the classroom, going through great books and, and poems and stories and plays and helping people to sort of have these experiences of great literature, transformative experiences, and enable them to do what you can do with a truly great work of literature is the degree to which that great work of literature penetrates your own ideas and thoughts, and finding those moments. That was attractive to me well before I joined the Foreign Service. So I think it was kind of embedded in a way in my personality. And even as a public diplomacy officer, when you are writing a speech or preparing talking points or organizing a press conference, that's a form of teaching. That's a form of communicating ideas in ways that are going to be easily accessible to your audiences and are going to be impactful. That's what a teacher does every day when he or she or they walk into a classroom. So I think that it was sort of from in my own understanding of public diplomacy, it was sort of embedded in the practice. And then whenever, starting, I think as early as Morocco, I didn't do much of it in Haiti because of the coup d'etat, but certainly then in Tunis, I lectured as often as I could. That's one of the, go to a university or a high school classroom and, talk about American history, or, or explain American literature, or, just I would go and talk about aspects of our history or culture. And I got into the habit of preparing these presentations, but with my audiences in mind, like what do they already know and don't know? And what could I say to them that could be meaningful to them? And then of course, depending on the language I was doing it, and that also had, an impact. And that I found very powerful and very compelling.
I see. Yeah, because I can tell naturally as a person, even if, let's say, I'm a prospective student, just hearing you talk, you're so engaging. Like I was so engaged by those stories. Like you have that natural lecture type of thing. And it makes sense. One, I mean, being trained at U Chicago with your PhD, but then also being a public diplomat, you just have ample opportunity to do all this.
Yes.
So yeah, that makes so much sense. Yeah, it's like talking to you. It feels like I'm talking to a teacher, let's say at the writing center or something at the Kelly Writer House at UPenn. So it's like you have that same vibe. Shout out Al. I was thinking, I was like, you two have such a similar type of vibe, similar lecturing style, and it's awesome. I think students need more of that. Like you can really, really elaborate and get people to think for 20 minutes, right? That's what we need in this type of, not like bite-sized things. I was just having a conversation with someone about this. I'm like, please don't send me bite-sized reels on Instagram about some foreign policy thing. I want to go deep 2 hours into it.
Yeah. In the end, when I made the transition, I didn't have to leave the Foreign Service when I did. I was, senior Foreign Service minister counselor, and I could have stayed on, but I began to, especially after a very challenging year in Afghanistan, where I worked on border coordination. I wasn't even doing public diplomacy. I came to believe that in the end, where I could be most used, where my gifts were best used, was training the next generation. Your generation, and it's how to make you as strong and resilient as possible, because this is already your show, and even more so going to be your show. And so I see my mission as preparing everyone for that responsibility. And I thought that was probably what that's something that I could offer that would be meaningful. So that's why I left when I did, rather than stay on to, do whatever might have come next.
Yeah, exactly. And I think someone probably would definitely ask this. So they're able to transfer you from a public diplomat into like a border type of person. So like they can do that?
Yes, the system is shifting a little bit right now, but at the time, you had to do a certain number of jobs within your specialization, public diplomacy, but you were also encouraged to take jobs outside of that specialization: politics, economic section, consular section, even doing a USAID tour, because the idea was it brought greater breadth, and because you brought fresh thinking into those, going back to, how would a public diplomacy officer approach preparing, and delivering a démarche, or, so there's a very interesting cross-fertilization. So those opportunities were there. And so at that point, my husband was I remarried, and my current husband is Foreign Service officer, and he wanted to go to Afghanistan. And so I looked for a position to join him, and there wasn't, at my rank, there wasn't a public diplomacy position available. That senior position had been filled. So they said, okay, well, we really need someone to do border coordination. Do you want to try it? And I said, sure. And I learned, how effective I was. Well, that's another question, but I think that is part of the larger question of how effective any diplomacy is when your diplomacy takes place behind yards and yards of barbed wire and blast-proof walls and Humvees, and yeah, it's a militarized diplomacy that I'm not fully convinced is effective. But that said, it was an extraordinary experience.
Wow. Do you write about this stuff, whether in an online journal, in books, or anything like that?
I've done a fair amount of writing, but mostly shorter pieces on public diplomacy, less of the memoirs. However, I'm about to upload I was asked to do oral history for ADST, the American Diplomat Studies and Training Academy. Anyway, it's the organization that carries the oral histories of American diplomats, and I'm one of them. And I'm about to upload the edited version of my interview, and some of those stories are in there. So that'll go live soon. And in the process of editing it all, and I was just doing the editing recently, I realized that I probably should start doing more writing about those experiences, which I haven't done. But the raw material is going to be made public shortly.
Wow. I'm very excited. Will people be able to access, will anyone be able to access those oral histories?
Yes, as soon as there are, I'll find the website and link for you. But yeah, they're accessible to everybody. The idea is for researchers and students and policymakers to be able to go online and pull it down. It's all public access, free. And the role of the organization is to capture all of these experiences over time. And there has some really truly extraordinary diplomats who have given interviews. So it's a tremendous resource. It's just they're a small organization, so it's not carefully indexed and categorized. It's simply, here is 50 pages of a transcript by Vivian S. Walker, and if you want to know what's in it, you got to read all 50 pages. And so it's, for a pure researcher, it's a dream. For the day tripper who just wants to dip in and out, it's not that useful. So really, the onus is on me to then take those experiences and then package them and put them out there in ways that make them more accessible. But they will, as a chunk of text, it will be available. So great for researchers, less good for, people who are just mildly curious.
And that's a first step. I think once those come out, and I'll keep encouraging you.
Okay.
You might want to start like a Beehive or, a Substack or something. Very soon it's going to become a book series or something like that.
Yeah. No, it's, I realized as I was going through the materials, because I did it 5 years ago, and then I got so busy with everything else that, it's only now recently that I've had time to go back. I thought, wow, I did all that. I forgot.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much context that you gave me, because I started traveling down to Florida starting last year, and I met a lot of Haitians. And I Uber drivers, Haitians, fighter friends that are Haitians. And I was just like, wow, there's a whole part of America, like the Americas, that I was never really taught in school.
And our history with those, between the colonization and the militarization, our history, as always, U.S. history is fraught there. But Haitian, it was the second republic in the Western Hemisphere, because it declared itself a republic in the teens? I can't remember now. And the first African-American republic in history. So Haiti, in the arc of its existence, has a storied presence in the region, but it has been racked with, by cycle after cycle of violence. And so this extraordinary culture and people and potential and possibility, so many Haitian writers and artists and musicians, who have scattered to the four winds because their home is this constant, there's this constant churn and cycle that And so it's a very interesting problem, but enormously rich culture and traditions, and it's heartbreaking
Yeah,
to see what
exactly.
has happened.
Wow. So I think we can end here because obviously I would love to talk to you again. And I'm sure even if we continue this conversation now, we could talk for a long time. For students at Georgetown, what classes do you teach?
So I teach public diplomacy
Mhm.
in 3.0, or public diplomacy for the digital age. Basically,
Oh,
it's looking about, how you reimagine public diplomacy for the digital age. So that is a course that I've taught every spring. And then I developed a new course. It's funny you mentioned your writing teacher or your writing center, because I've developed the first course at Georgetown, and I think I haven't seen too many like it. It's called The Diplomat's Pen,
ooh,
and it's foreign policy writing for foreign policy professionals. So I also teach that, and it was an experiment, and I ran it the second time this last year, and I'm going to keep running it. And I really, really enjoyed that, because I focus on the students, on them as writers, but also as editors and readers. And when you get done with my class, it's going to help your writing, but it's going to make you a better editor and a better reader of your other people's work. Because as I point out to all of them, as you rise up in the ranks of any of these services, in the beginning, you do all the writing. In the end, people are writing for you, or you're editing the work that they've prepared for you to make it better. So writing is just one part of it. Being a reader and an editor and a consumer of that and a user of that product is also something that I teach them.
wow. That's so exciting. So yeah, Vivian, I would say maybe like once a semester or something, if you're down, let's do more talks, because I have a feeling
Absolutely.
like I want to also encourage you in the future, start a podcast or something. I think you'd be really good at doing a podcast, like explore all the different podcasting platforms there are online.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll just keep encouraging you to do this,
Okay.
because you were the first Georgetown professor I found when I was doing my application. So like, I remember I was like, oh, wow, if all the professors are like Vivian, oh, I want to go. I'm telling you, like, you made a big impression on me. So
Oh, thank you.
yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to hear you say that, and I'm always happy to help, whether it's through an interview or whether you want to talk about the work of public diplomacy, or if you're writing something or thinking about doing something. I'm always happy to talk it through, because it's a passion, as you can tell, kind of.
Yeah.
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 So.
So for everyone watching, of course, I will link Vivian's webpage from the Georgetown website. But if you guys leave questions and stuff, next time I talk to her, we can answer some of your questions. And if you want specific topics that we didn't talk about, I started my conversation with her when I first reached out to her. I talked about my first experience with China's public diplomacy.
Yep.
So if you guys want to hear about that next time, I actually dug up my writing, my essay for my ethnomusicology class. And I was going to send it to Vivian, but then now I'm much older. I look at it, I was like, oh, I need to correct it more. Like I didn't like my writing style anymore. So it's a side I've grown. I've grown as a person.
That's good. That's good, because you're doing what I'm trying to teach my students to do, is to go back and look at it with, not the eyes of an audience, the audience you want to reach. And then you end up reading it very differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Basically, in a word, I wrote it for fellow students. And it was too snarky. And it's like, no, if I want Vivian to read it, it can't be that snarky. So I was in the process of correcting it, but then, I got busy. But maybe one day I'll read it for Vivian.
You have to look at it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, everyone. This was Vivian Walker. She will be back. Vivian, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jerry. Take care.